Alright, welcome to AP Comparative Government. What we're going to be looking at here in this first lesson is we're going to be setting a lot of the framework for the things that we need to know in order to be successful with our programs moving forward throughout the semester. So a lot of this stuff is really basic introductory content that's really going to be able to help us figure out how to compare countries and how to be successful with what's going on throughout the rest of the course. So comparativists. What we need to do is first we need to understand kind of the basis for what we're going to be looking at this year. So comparativists, who are they? What do they do? Comparativists are social scientists, and what they try and do is they try to understand the similarities and differences found among national governments and other political units around the world. And we're going to talk about what all of these different political units are and these national units and things like that. We've got lots of different definitions that we need to kind of establish here at the beginning. Alright, so they are social scientists, so they look at the social concepts and the social constructs of what exists within a country. Alright, comparativists study roughly 190 countries and focus on domestic policies. So domestic policies are policies that take place at home. They could look at elections, welfare systems, so how are the people taken care of, how involved is the government, how involved is the government not. Identity-based conflicts, so we're looking at race, we're looking at ethnicity, we're looking at religion. All of those different things play into that identity-based conflict. Terrorism, which is a huge concept throughout the world. The environment, do countries take an active involvement in trying to protect the environment? Do they have policies, do they lack policies to be able to do that? The status of women and racial minorities, which all kind of plays back into that identity-based conflict, but also we kind of look at those as separate entities as well. And there's lots of other things that we're going to look at. We're going to look at wealth, we're going to look at freedom, we're going to look at civil liberties and social constructs and things like that. So there's lots of different things that comparativists kind of pull in to be able to try and understand the things that they're studying. Alright, so comparison. In order to gain a proper understanding of what's going on in the world, we compare systems. Alright, comparisons are made on a daily basis in order to analyze the choices that politicians and governments make in establishing the future of their states. And the way that they're going to try and establish the future of their states is by passing policy. Alright, and policy are just the laws and things like that that are put in place that people have to follow, and those policies largely shape the direction in which that country is going to move. Alright, so these comparisons are often built with the hope of developing a theory that explains various patterns throughout the world. Alright, so theory, just the same kind of concept that you would talk about in a science classroom. Alright, that theory is kind of this overarching set of rules and set of circumstances that help you understand the way things take place between countries and throughout the world. Alright, this means that we are looking for an idea that covers an entire discipline. Alright, there is no one theory that dominates world political systems. So even though they have tried to develop these theories in order to figure out what's going on throughout the world, there is no one system that dominates the entire thing. Alright, comparing. There is an argument amongst political scientists as to how countries should be compared. Alright, so there's all sorts of things, even as old as this field is trying to compare what's going on. There's lots of debate as to how it should take place. Alright, two ways that comparatives compare countries is through the use of empirical data and normative data. Alright, empirical data are based on factual statements and statistics. Alright, so if I were to hand out a survey and had you rank things 1 to 10, and then compiled all of that data to come up with an understanding of how you guys felt about certain topics, then that would be empirical data. Alright, if I were to count the numbers of A, B, C, D's, and F's in the course, and then analyze that statistically, that would be empirical data. So anytime we're kind of manipulating numbers, really hard facts, things that can be backed up very strongly through that kind of interpretation of numerical data is what we're looking at with empirical concepts. If we're looking at normative data, that's based upon value judgments. So say we sat down and I interviewed you about how much you liked cheese pizza. Alright, and I went through and I interviewed 100 people on that, and I kind of ranked all of you based upon how much I thought you liked pizza based upon your responses, then that would be normative data. So normative data is when you take what people say through interviews, through speeches, through journal entries and things like that. Those are all normative concepts. All right. So when looking at data, we can also divide into two other categories. And these categories are qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative data relates to measuring the quality of something rather than its quantity. So interviews, journals, entries, etc. So most of the time, so if we were to relate this back to empirical and normative data, qualitative data is generally going to go in that normative category. So you're going to use qualitative data to come up with normative concepts. And quantitative data, which relates to the measuring the quantity of something rather than its quality, such as measuring cups, length, the number of times someone says something, those would be all empirical concepts. So we can put those under those empirical or normative data concepts. All right, good data. In order for data to be useful, it must be valid. There are two different ways to validate data. All right, one is we can have external validity. External validity is the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized to other situations and other people. So, say we were to look at the performance of your class. If your class gets 10 A's, 5 B's, 3 C's, and then that's it, and then if we were to compare you to another comparative class, and the grades were very similar to each other, then that would be external validity. We would know that what is happening in your classroom is generalizable to another classroom that's going on, and then we would be able to compare that as normal. But even beyond that, say we were able to take those two classes, and we were able to compare that to comparative classes throughout the country. If those grades are very similar, then we know that we've got really good external validity. We know that what's going on in our classroom matches up really well with what's going on elsewhere. Now, if we were to then compare that to, say, another classroom in which most of the students are failing, and that we saw that happening on a wide basis, then we would know that what we were doing wasn't necessarily externally valid, because it's not taking place in lots of other places. You can't generalize it to other situations. So if you can generalize it to another situation, that means that you have external validity. Internal validity is when the researcher is able to minimize bias during the process of completing the study and the analysis. So say, for instance, we go back to the cheese pizza example that I gave you before. If I have a really strong liking for cheese pizza, that may give me bias in doing what is going on with other cheese pizzas. I might look at that and go, well, I really like cheese pizza, so I think that you really like cheese pizza, so I'm going, and if that skews it to where I make most people seem to like that, then that is going to destroy our internal validity. So what we need to do with internal validity, anytime that you're doing a study, and if you're a comparativist, you need to get rid of any sort of bias that you may have. And that may come into play, say, throughout the semester, is, say you have an inherent bias against communism. All right, and you already have this real strong, deep-seated hatred for that. That's going to color your viewpoint as far as how you compare maybe Russia compared to a non-communist state. So it's one of those things to where when we make our comparisons, we need to be making sure that we get rid of our biases that we have, and that we use the facts and the figures that have been compiled in order to make those comparisons accurately. All right. Political scientists rely heavily on the scientific method to make appropriate comparisons. After reviewing earlier researchers formulate a hypothesis, and they look at the relationship between multiple variables. So just like we would see in the scientific method in your science classroom, all right, we're looking to create a hypothesis to begin, because we need to kind of have an idea of where we think things are prior to looking. And it doesn't mean that because we've got this hypothesis already that we're looking to necessarily prove that. We just need a starting point, a place to go from the beginning. All right. So hypothesis, a look at the relationship between multiple variables. All right. And variables are measurable traits or characteristics that change under different conditions. All right. And we're going to look at different types of variables here in a second. Researchers then try and determine causation. Causation is the principle where one variable is directly responsible for the action of another variable. So if we were to look at that, I get into a car accident. So if I hit another car and the front end of my car gets destroyed, then we can say that that's causation. So that's what they're looking for. They're looking to be able to see what happens, and then what happens as a direct result of that. Now, we can't always do that, and I'm going to skip here a little bit. We can't always determine causation. Sometimes we have to determine correlation. And after this slide in the downloadable PowerPoint that you have from the website, there's going to be a short little video that's kind of going to explain why you have to be careful with causation and correlation. All right. Correlation exists when a change in one variable coincides with a change in another variable, but when you can't necessarily prove causation. So just because, say, let's use this as an example. Say you get promoted to 10th grade. All right, and we talk about reading levels. All right, just because you move to 10th grade doesn't necessarily mean that you move to a 10th grade reading level. All right, we just look at that because a lot of times there's a correlation between age and reading level, but that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you move to 10th grade that causes you to move to a 10th grade reading level. Some of you hit a 10th grade reading level in elementary school. Other people won't hit a 10th grade reading level until a few years after they hit 10th grade. So just because you move into 10th grade doesn't mean that causes you to read at a 10th grade reading level. It just means that there's a correlation. All right, now let's backtrack for a second and let's look at variables real quick. There are two different types of variables that we can look at. We can look at independent variables and we can look at dependent variables. An independent variable is one that influences the variable, and a dependent variable is what is influenced. So let's go back to the car crash. That car is a car no matter what. All right, so that is the dependent variable. The crash is the independent variable. That is the thing that we are imposing upon the car. So if you get into that car crash and it smashes the front end of your car, then the independent variable is the actual crash, and the dependent variable is the car. So when we look at dependent variables, they are what they are no matter what. And it is that independent variable, the thing that we are implementing, that is going to cause that change. Alright, so we've also got a couple of different types of reasoning we can look at. We can have inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning is using the facts that surround you to come to a conclusion. When it rains, the trees get wet. The trees are wet this morning, so it rained last night. That is an example of inductive reasoning. So you're using the facts around you to come to a conclusion. All trees have trunks. An oak tree is a tree. Therefore, deductive reasoning tells you that an oak tree has a trunk. All right, with deductive reasoning occurs when you determine a hypothesis and then find data to support that claim. Every house that burned down on the block was caused by faulty wiring. Your conclusion is that all homes on the block have faulty wiring. Now, deductive reasoning is something that you have to be very careful about because it's hard to make a lot of these conclusions. Red lights prevent accidents. Mike did not have an accident, so therefore Mike stopped at a red light. That may not necessarily be true. You could have driven around your neighborhood and not seen a single red light the entire time. All right, deductive reasoning can also work in reverse when you falsify the theory and then find something that agrees with the concept. All right, you then have to determine why this discrepancy exists, and you generally do not want to do that. You don't want to find a theory and then try and find what's wrong with it or try and find something that agrees with that concept. Really, what you want to do is you want to look at all available data and then come to the conclusion. All right, theories. So we're going to look at a couple of theories here that we would use for comparative government here. One is the concept of rational choice theory. This theory focuses on how individuals maximize their interests through actions such as voting or rebelling against the government. This theory is based upon the idea that people will make choices that work in their best own interest. Now, that is something we have to take with a grain of salt when we think about the concept of rational choice theory, because people do all sorts of crazy things that are in their worst interest. When we look at the concept of rational choice theory, just look at American politics, for instance. American politicians have an approval rating of about 10% right now. That is Congress's approval rating at this current time. But yet 91 to 92% of those people will get reelected coming up in this midterm election. And this is a historical trend that we see over and over and over again. So this idea that people will make decisions that are best for them is something that we really have to question, because a lot of times people make really dumb decisions that don't go towards their best intentions. All right. We also have middle level theory. Middle level theory is the idea that focuses on specific features of the political world, such as institutions, policies, or classes of similar events such as revolutions or elections. So according to Ziblatt, middle level theory is not about creating a grand overarching theory of why governments function as they do. but it is designed to focus on smaller features and explain both processes and outcome of the event. One process and outcome has been determined, a broader theory can be created based upon that empirical evidence. So it's saying you look at everything, and then you find a nice happy medium in the middle. So I see all of these different things happening. I see the craziness on one side, I see the super conservatism on the other, and we can boil that all down and get to this middle level concept that kind of helps explain both sides of it. All right, systems theory. System theory revolves around 5 concepts: inputs, decision-making, outputs, feedback, and the environment. So when we look at all these different things, inputs are the way that average citizens and the group they form engage in political life. Whether it be through voting, whether it be through protest, through media, all of these different things are inputs in different ways in which the people within a society can tell the government why they want what they want. Alright, so we're going to look at some countries where there's lots of input. Say the United States or the UK. There's lots and lots of input from the people. They vote. They tell the politicians what they want. They protest when they don't get the things that they want. They can use the media to try and petition for what they want. So there's all sorts of different ways for people to get involved. And then we're going to look at countries like Iran, where there's little to no input from the people. And it's all really going to be based upon the type of government, the type of civil society that you have. Alright, and once we get past the concept of inputs and we move past this idea of civil society, we've got decision-making. And decision-making is that interim concept where the government is going to look at policy, they're going to look at the different types of decisions that they should be trying to make before they come to a conclusion as far as where they're going to go as a country. Alright? And we can look at this when we look at the types of activities. We can, either by the people or by the governmenters, we can have activities that support the state, things that are, saying, hey, you're doing a good job, or those that place demands on the state that ask them to do things. So in that decision-making process, they're going to look at whether or not you're saying that they're doing a good job or doing a bad good job, and then they're going to try and figure out what they should do. Then we look at output. Output is whatever policy that the government decides to put out. Whether they put out policy to try and help you and meet the demands of what you want, whether or not they put out whatever policy they want to, or whether or not they put out policy to try and suppress the things that you're trying to say. Alright, and then we get feedback. Once you get feedback, that is the people responding to the policy that has been put in place. Alright, so either people like the policy and they give them good stuff, which is new good input, or they don't like the policy that's been put in place, and then they're giving them negative input. Alright, then we have the environment, and that's everything else that lays outside of the government. Alright, that's the history of the government, the history of the people. How does that all play in? Because that really does play a huge role, that contextual concept. Limits imposed by domestic, social, economic, and physical conditions. The type of government system, the type of economic system, how wealthy that country is, all of those different things. The physical conditions, do they have lots of natural resources? Do they not have natural resources? Is there a disaster? Is there not a disaster? All of these things really play into kind of what that government's going to do as well as global conditions. How does the rest of the world feel about the things that you were doing? Those are all important concepts. Alright, comparing. So we can do some different types of comparing. Alright, throughout the semester we will divide the world into 3 different spheres using the 3-world approach. That's something that we're going to look at. We've got the United States and its allies. So these are what we would consider first world countries. Alright, countries that have largely been through the Industrial Revolution. They are generally free countries, democratic, those types of things. Those are going to fall into that first world concept. Second world is the Soviet Union, which is not the Soviet Union anymore, but we still kind of classify Russia within this second world concept. So it's where we've got Russia and the other communist or semi-communist or countries that generally fall into that more repressive regime concept. And then we've got the third world, which are what we're also going to refer to as least developed or less developed countries. So countries that are really kind of on that lower end of the spectrum. There are also a variety of other ways in which we can make comparisons, and we'll look at these a little bit as well. The impact of informal concepts. So we'll be able to look at civil society, the way that citizens organize and define themselves and their interests. So how do societies, how do people do things? Informal politics. We're going to look at that and see how that takes take into consideration not only the ways that politicians operate outside their formal powers, but also the impact that beliefs, values, and actions of ordinary citizens have on policymaking. So how do people impact policy? All right, we can take the most different approach, which is where we look at polar opposites to try and come up with a theory. We can look at most similar, which is when we look at things that are as close as possibly we can to be able to come up with some sort of theory as to how things go on. We can look at the choice approach, which is a broad approach to studying politics and understanding political outcomes that emphasize individual political leadership in the process of individual decision making. So how do individuals make choices? How do politicians make choices? How do leaders make choices? And we can also look at the structural approach. And this is a broad approach to studying politics that seeks to explain political outcomes by looking at the effects of the underlying economic, social, or political institutional settings. So here what we're going to talk about is we're going to briefly talk about inputs again, just so we can drive this concept home. So remember, after citizens have offered input into what should happen in the government, the result equals policy. So remember, input is all of the different things they say, through voting, through media, through protest, through petition, all of those different ways to be able to try and talk about the things that they want to see get done. All right, public policy regulates the behavior of individuals or organizations. It redistributes resources and can be symbolic. Okay, so a symbolic thing would be like, all right, so on Thursday we're going to celebrate Free Pizza Day, and it's one of those things to where it's a symbolic concept that everybody feels proud of. All right, the system is then analyzed by using feedback. How do people feel about the policies that have been passed, and how did they find out about the policy? Did the government tell them? Did somebody else tell them? And it allows us to see how systems change over time. All right, so that's the end of our first lesson. These will keep going back up, so we'll be able to continue looking at different things that are going to take place within our comparative system.